Hello, BookTube. Today we are going to be talking about sci-fi and fantasy from the 90s. I've got the sci-fi covered. Mike, have you got my back with some fantasy recommendations?
I think I have narrowed it down to 5 choice picks, yes.
I appreciate it. Mike, from Mike's Book Reviews, I've got to give you some flowers real quick because I'm a big Sun Eater fan. And I feel like I was fairly early to the Sun Eater train, started reading and making videos in 2021, and it was because of your review. So I just wanted to give you a quick shout out, a quick thank you for getting me on the Sun Eater, making me a part of the Sun Eater empire.
Hey, my pleasure. I'm glad it's finally taken off. Seems like everybody's reading it now, and I mean, I'm happy for Christopher because I said again, he deserves to be a household name in the sci-fi community, and I think he is. He's finally on his way. He's made it. I think.
Absolutely. And I think as someone that's more of a sci-fi reader, you read a bit of everything, but maybe a little bit more fantasy.
I
Sun
do.
Eater is bringing people together. The sci-fantasy, it's a series we can all get behind.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's one of those. If you're trying to make the transition from fantasy to sci-fi, I think it's probably a good place to start. Yeah.
Awesome. So when I think about the history of science fiction, moving from classic to modern, different time periods in the 60s and 70s, you have new wave, 80s and 90s. With things like the internet and computers, sci-fi, we started to get a lot of tech-driven subgenres like cyberpunk, the techno thriller, the space opera made a bit of a resurgence, but with less pulp and more of a hard sci-fi angle. That's what I
Mhm.
think of when I think of 90s sci-fi. Some of the first few things that come to mind. For you, 90s fantasy, are there any subgenres, tropes, trends that come to mind for you?
I mean, I feel like everything now is about like either how perverted can we make it or how dark can we make it? Everything's about is it grim dark or is it not? Or is it,
Interesting.
YA? It seems like on BookTube, everything is either YA or grim dark. It's like, is there just like, good adult fantasy left anymore? So I feel like there isn't really wiggle room. Whereas in the 90s, it was still pretty much traditional until I think Tad Williams and George R. R. Martin changed the game a little bit, I think. And we'll get into that because you might hear both of those names tonight. But yeah, I still think in the 90s, it still was very much, if you weren't writing, especially the early 90s, if you weren't writing like J.R.R. Tolkien, you weren't getting published. That's why the first Wheel of Time book, everyone's like, this feels like discount Lord of the Rings. It's because,
Mm.
again, you weren't getting published at that time period unless you were writing like Tolkien, because they all just wanted the next Lord of the Rings. So some people made a great career out of that, Terry Brooks, and other people just kind of said, I want to do something different. And they kind of hung out in the back until finally it seemed like fantasy readers were able to accept new and original ideas.
Interesting. So we're going to give you guys some book recommendations, maybe that helps define the genre, push the genre forward a little bit. I will start us off with our first sci-fi recommendation. One
I'm
that's
ready
on
to
a
write these down.
yeah, this is one that is on the softer end. I think you might like this one, Mike. This is called The Carpet Makers by Andreas Eschbach. So this was actually originally written in German, but was translated into English. And the premise for this one is that we have somewhat of a dying Earth type setting. It feels a little bit like fantasy initially, and we have people that weave together these incredibly intricate, incredibly large carpets that they take an entire lifetime to make. People dedicate their lives to making these carpets. And the story is told in a series of stories that all connect together. So each of them is sort of satisfying as its own story, but they combine together into a novel. They weave together a narrative tapestry, a carpet of its own, if you will. And through the stories, we learn a little bit more about the empire, the technology, the true sort of secrets and reasons behind the purpose of these carpets. And I'm not someone that is normally drawn to short stories as much as novels. This too combines those two formats in a way that I thought was absolutely masterful.
So it's a novella?
It's a novel. It's only about like 300 pages though.
See, so as fantasy fans, that's a novella. Yeah.
Yeah, fair.
I
So
see.
that's a moderate sized book for the classic
So
sci-fi
there's nothing
fans.
like magical or scientific about the carpets. They're just carpets.
The carpets themselves, I would say the carpets themselves are fairly carpety.
Oh,
There are mysteries though, why there is this tradition, and it what seems like a very small story at first. It's very personal. You learn about like the carpet makers and their families. It kind of grows into this kind of like galactic empire type story. So it sounds a little bit soft at first, but there's a little bit of humor, there's a little bit of violence. It really kind of weaves together a lot of different elements. In
Hmm.
the ending's a little bit controversial. Personally, I thought it was brilliant, but some people might raise an eyebrow for some. But I think it's well worth your time. I read it this year, and it's definitely it's in the running for book of the read of the year for me.
Well, the reason I asked is because it made me think of when you started talking about carpets. I'm like, are they like wormholes or something? Because like, there's this book by Clive Barker called Weave World, where basically it's almost like Dark Tower, where it's like kind of like a door to another universe of portal fantasy, you know. So I was curious if it's something like that, but no, just I can honestly say I've never even heard of this one, so I'll have to look this up.
Yeah, because it was published in Germany, it wasn't super well known initially, but it got a has an introduction from Orson Scott Card, writer of Ender's Game, brilliant writer, controversial character. But either
Mm.
way, that sort of helped push it into the English speaking audience a little bit more, and I think it's brilliant.
Yeah, Ender's Game's like my second favorite sci-fi book ever, so that would probably raise an eyebrow from me if it's getting his recommendation. Sure.
Nice.
Are we alternating? Is it my turn now?
Yes, hit us with your
Okay.
first fantasy rec.
All right. Well, you know what? I've got like a mix of. I mean, I don't think I have anything on here that no one's ever heard of before. The '90s fantasy. There's not a lot of hidden gems that I've read because there's still a lot of the popular '90s fantasy I've never read. So let's just start off with the big one that everyone here has heard of, but it is my favorite fantasy series of all time, and that was 1996 with the Game of Thrones by some dude named George R. R. Martin. And I think that this is when fantasy was on its way to completely changing because you didn't have the whole thing where characters were safe. You didn't have the whole thing where there was clear cut, white good guys, dark bad guys, that kind of thing. There is like, characters that are less likable, and there are some our heroes do some things that are maybe a little questionable, I think. So it created like the gray character in fantasy and made you be like, huh, I don't know why I'm cheering for this guy, but I am, and then it just completely turns everything on its head when you think the character that's going to be the main character of the story. Well, maybe not so fast, my friend. So that's something I feel like is not really a spoiler because by now everybody knows about George is that he has no problem offing his characters, I think. But
Yeah.
at this point, I feel like it's such a pop culture thing that everybody knows what this book is about. But 1996, to me, I read it in the year 2000, and this was the series that changed everything for me in fantasy. Having only read Lord of the Rings and tapping out in book one of Wheel of Time. At the time, I have since went back, but at the time, I was like, after Lord of the Rings, Wheel of Time just wasn't what I was looking for, and I got this, and it just changed everything, including my expectations for what fantasy could be. Have you ever indulged, my friend?
I haven't. I have watched the show. I have, as a booktuber, I like watching a lot of videos about fantasy, but we are specializing in sci-fi here on the channel. So it is when I do eventually break out, and I'll resist as long as I can, fighting on behalf of us sci-fi fans. But when I eventually crack, A Song of Ice and Fire is definitely near the top of the
Yeah, I think
list.
back to when that show was first starting, and I was like begging everyone I knew to watch it because I wanted the show to get to at least book three, which is my favorite fantasy book ever. And everyone's like, "Oh, I just don't like fantasy." I'm like, "It doesn't matter if you don't like fantasy. It's different. It kind of transcends that." And I'm glad that eventually it got there. But I almost say it's like a good place to start because it is way different than sci-fi. There's a bazillion characters and lands and histories to learn as you go along. But I do feel like it's one that would be easier than like going back to like a Sword of Shannara or all the way back to like Lord of the Rings or something. I think it would be a little more approachable for modern readers. I think.
Yeah, even though I haven't read the books, just from watching the show, it does sort of define how I think about powerful families and political maneuvering and things like that. Even in sci-fi books, where when I read something like Deathstalker or Sun Eater or the Texcalan duology,
Definitely.
anything where it has those kind of elements, I do kind of compare it to Game of Thrones. It kind of is almost the
Yeah.
gold standard in that regard.
When, the show got really popular, that's how I tried to sell people on Dune. Dune, I was like, "It's just Westeros, but spaceships instead of dragons."
Yeah,
Because there is a lot of the house politics and stuff that, very clear, influence, but yeah, good stuff.
awesome. Well, I will read it eventually. I need to.
Awesome.
All right, let's see. Okay, for my second pick, I think this might be on your TBR, Mike. I'm not sure if you've read this one yet. It is Snow Crash by
It is.
Neil
It's been there for like a
Stevenson.
year.
So, this is a cyberpunk novel. although it has a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek tone to it. Neil Stevenson introduces us to a character that is a hacker and also a pizza delivery driver, which I appreciated as a former pizza delivery driver, not hacker, unfortunately. And we are introduced to a sort of a digital world, which I'm sure is a big influence on a lot of recent things we've seen, like Ready Player One.
Ready Player when I read the synopsis for this, is like, is this did Ready Player One rip this off? You know? So and everybody's like, ah, it's kind of different. But yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, no, there's definitely some similarities. I would say it goes about things in a different way. It is funny, but also quite serious, and it's quite nerdy, but not so much in a nostalgic referencey way, which some people like about Ready Player One, some people poke fun at it for, but more in a historical and religious way, and it kind of weaves um, history and technology together in a really interesting way. It kind of has like a bit of a Da Vinci Code type feel to it at times, and
Wow. Okay.
Neil Stevenson is not afraid of some info dumps. Now, if you're averse to info dumps, Neil Stevenson might not be the writer for you, but I actually found all of the information that he gives to be really interesting. So, a couple pages at a time of new information that kind of provides clues and context and direction for where the story is going to go, as well as that cool virtual world. I think it's a fun place to start with cyberpunk that's maybe less gritty and dystopian than some other cyberpunk books. This one has some jokes which some people think are cool, some people think are corny. I think it's a little bit of a mix of both, but overall, I had a lot of fun with Snow Crash.
Yeah, I definitely want to do it. But I think he was just a name that always came up a lot, and I said I'd like to start. And that was the one that everybody told me I need to start with that one. But it just seems like there's just such polarizing opinions about it. People either absolutely love it or can't stand it. And usually I'll have a pretty good sense where people will tell me, after watching hundreds of hours of your content, I think you're either going to like this or don't like it. That one's mixed. It seems up in the air. People are like, I don't know how you're going to feel about it, so I'm anxious to see. And I think I had that on my December TBR 2 Decembers ago, and it just keeps on getting slid and slid and slid. And that's just since I'm finishing up a lot of series, that kind of happened. But I'm a little more loose this year, so maybe this will be the year it finally happens.
Well, I'm about 75% sure you'll like it. So
Okay. All right. Good. Good.
we'll see.
Well, see, the thing with Ready Player One, not to derail, is I liked it when I read it because I am an '80s kid, So obviously, I was all about all the references and stuff. In hindsight, though, I'm kind of just, and I don't know if this is Moyd's fault from Moyd. I don't know if what's this channel called? Media Death Cult. I had a blank there for a
Yeah.
second. I don't know if maybe he poisoned me against it, but in hindsight, it's just like, dude, anybody can just sit there and make a bunch of like Star Trek references and stuff. This isn't that funny, but I
Mhm.
liked it at the time. But I feel like I don't know. Thinking back on, it, I'm kind of like, it was okay. I didn't read the sequel.
I heard not so great things about the sequel. I liked it too. I think, obviously it doesn't have the weight of like a Dune or a Hyperion,
Sure,
but
sure.
I enjoyed it for what it was. And I'm in defense of the list, because people have said it's just lists of nostalgic video games and movie references and whatnot. When you read it out loud, it doesn't sound great. Okay, if you do the audio book, maybe the experience is not as good. But for me, when I got to those paragraphs that were just kind of listing stuff, my eyes would just sort of skim over them, and I'd be like, "Oh, I played that one," or "I recognize
Yeah.
that name," and then I'd skip on to the next paragraph. So it didn't hinder my reading experience that much. But when you read it out loud, it does sound a little bit
I
silly.
I remember I had never actually seen War Games until I read that book. I was like, okay, let's see what they're talking about. It's a good movie, but yeah, I got all the other references, especially the Rush ones, because I'm a big Rush fan. But all right, I completely
Nice.
derailed away from Snow Crash, but
No, I like it.
I definitely want to go for it.
Mike, what is your second fantasy book?
All right, all right. Now, again, I think the guy that really did change the game in fantasy because he was like the first one that kind of felt like Tolkien, but yet it had stakes. And I mean, like that characters could die, they could do really messed up things. You could have your protagonist doing really, really shady stuff. You could have your villains be a little bit more relatable, where you can understand that they don't think they're the bad guy. Beautiful writer. I think that this guy absolutely inspired Robin Hobb to write Realm of the Elderlings. I'm talking about Tad Williams and the biggest book I've ever read, The Green Angel Tower. Look at this sucker. So he was
Hefty.
contracted to do a trilogy, and this is very clearly two books. He said, I'm going to tell my whole story. So big, it had to be printed on two paperbacks initially. But The Green Angel Tower came out in 1993, so I'm going to count it here. So it is book three. Series actually started in the 80s, but there are so many series you can see. Even George was highly influenced by this for Song of Ice and Fire. So much to the point that there's a lot of people are like, there's a lot of stuff in the Song of Ice and Fire that borrowed heavily from this. And George doesn't deny that. You know, it's never one of those things where you feel like it's a ripoff, but he just has this way of writing words that are just like, that's a beautiful string of words right there. I'm going to read that again. But it also isn't going to be for everyone. You talked about info dumps. With this is he's very good at, hey, I'm going to tell you about this character walking through the snow for about 40 pages. You know, he will do that quite a bit. And that's why you get books that are this quite this big. And that's why I say I can see for sure the Robin Hobb people that read Robin Hobb, I'm like, oh, her books are beautiful. Gosh, they're so slow. These are pretty slow. They really are. But it's one of those things that like all the threads tie together. You have all these different characters, all the threads tie together perfectly here at the end. This is one of the best resolutions in any series I've ever read because it comes together and it's just like a huge explosion. Everything just makes sense. And I think, and I hate to say this because fantasy fans love to say this, on a reread, you would notice all the foreshadowing and stuff that you didn't the first time around. But yeah, it's an investment because I actually took 2 months to read this book. But yeah, it's a really, really beautiful, beautiful series. And again, I think it's one that really was the changing of the guard from, hey, this is your traditional Tolkien-esque fantasy to, hey, we're going to take some steps and do some new things that fantasy's never done before, and up to and including violence and some things that some people might actually get triggered by and stuff because it's basically it went from PG to PG-13, and fantasy at the time
Mm,
wasn't really doing that. And yeah, I was quite happy when I did read it. Felt like I wish I'd read this earlier, honestly.
interesting. So I haven't read the series, but I am familiar with Tad Williams because I read the first book in his Otherland
Yeah, I'm
series,
gonna do that one next. Yeah.
his sci-fi series, and I really liked it initially. I thought the world building was great. I quite liked his prose. I liked his characters. And then 200 pages later, not that much had happened.
Yeah, he's good at that.
400 pages later, not much had happened. And by the end of book one, it almost felt like I'd read like a 700-page prologue. There really wasn't much payoff for finishing book one. With his fantasy series, is there a little bit more of a climax at the end of book one to reward you, or do you
There
really need
is,
to
yes.
go
He
all the
does,
way through?
slow burn fantasy, but very much in that Brandon Sanderson way, the Sanderlands, the third act is always just like, "Holy." So it's like
Okay.
it is a slow build, and it's worth it. He'll reward you if you stick with it, but you will have stretches for 200, 300 pages. My wife read it right after me, and she was like, "Can he get on with it?"
Yeah.
You know? Like I said, Stone of Farewell book 2, there is a scene where Simon, the protagonist, literally is just going through a snowstorm for like 50 pages. Like, what is the point of this? Can we get on with it? You know, so those things are there. So if it's you're wanting just like a super fast paced thriller of a fantasy, that ain't it. But yeah, the final acts always have you wanting to reach for the next book because they're so good.
Interesting. Yeah, I didn't mind the slow pacing initially, but then I didn't think there was that rewarding Act 3, so in Otherland. But so I'll be interested to see whether you enjoy it, how you think it compares. You've kind of built up that fantasy tolerance, that perseverance. You might be able
Mhm.
to pick up the next book anyway
I
and
have
get
to
the
take
payoff
breaks
that I
from it.
didn't get.
They have to take breaks from it because I will get some that are just really kind of a sludge fest just to get through. And it's like I enjoyed the book, but it could have been like 300 pages shorter. And you read I read almost all of Realm of the Eldlings last year, and that happens quite a bit. Love the series, don't get me wrong, but there is a lot of that. So I was like, okay, I need to take a break from some slow burn fantasy for a while. But yeah, yeah, you're used to it, I think, as a fantasy fan. But take breaks, or else you'll burn yourself out.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. Okay, for my third sci-fi book, I'm going to go with Ring by Stephen Baxter. So, this is one of my favorite subgenres, space opera, specifically hard sci fi space opera. So, in this story, we have a mission. Humans go get on a spaceship and they need to travel thousands of years. And what they do is they divide the spaceship into two sections. Essentially, two different factions form amongst the humans. And there is a section which has advanced technology. There's all the kind of things that you would expect on a spaceship. And then the other half is basically turned into a jungle. And people live a very primitive lifestyle. And so much time passes that people forget where they are, how they came to be,
Mm.
and that the other side of the spaceship even exists. So you have a couple of interesting things at play. in terms of where the ship is going and sort of like the giant epic space opera, science, cosmic strings, rings, things that are going on in the universe, wormholes, time travel, all this kind of crazy stuff. And then this kind of interesting character story about how different types of people coexist on the same spaceship. In terms of the ideas, I think this is one of the most mind-blowing books, sci-fi books I've ever read. The scale and the scope I can only compare to Alistair Reynolds in terms of the ideas. The writing's a bit dry. The only thing that brings it down, it is definitely hard sci-fi. Baxter's an actual physicist, and sometimes he wants to explain stuff to you. And and how he does that is he'll have a character say, "Oh, I think I get it. It kind of works like this, right?" And then a smarter character will be like, "Well, actually, 5-page explanation." So it doesn't have the smoothest flow to it, but I think it rewards you just with the absolutely nutty story and sci-fi ideas.
I prefer the Michael Crichton method. Yeah, I can explain it to you, the right way, or I can put it in layman's terms where
Yes,
everyone, like an idiot like you, Mike, can understand it. That's what I always appreciate about Michael Crichton. This sounds very familiar. You ever see this movie called Snowpiercer, where they're
I've
on the
heard of it,
train?
but I've
And
heard
it
of it, but I
has
haven't
like that where
watched it.
they're like it's like I think like subarctic outside, so all of humanity that's left is on this giant train, and it's like basically like the front is like the upper class elite and the back is like the slums kind of thing, and they're trying to
Mm,
fight their way up towards the front, and the whole battle between class warfare and stuff like that. That's kind of what that sounded like. Neat idea.
interesting.
Well,
Is
this
that
was an
based on a
influence.
book or is it just a
I'm not
film?
sure. I'm not sure. I saw the movie. Gosh, I don't know, years ago.
I'll have to
Good
check
flick.
that out because someone else recommended that to me just recently when I talked about a book, Inverted World by Christopher Priest. Somebody commented that that reminded them of Snowpiercer. So Snowpiercer, I guess, has a lot in common with some of
Yeah,
these.
maybe Ring was an influence. Who knows? Maybe. All
Interesting.
right, you guys have never heard of this one before. And I feel like the thing is like so many people get the false impression that, oh, that's just a stupid YA children's series or whatever. But to me, it will always be special. And that got special with The Prisoner of Azkaban. Book three in Harry Potter. Oh, God, what year was this? I think this was 97, 98. Anyway, thing was like I read the first two and I was like, "God, they're fun. They're enjoyable. I'm having a good time." This is the first one. I was like, this is actually really damn good. It's actually quite intricate, and it felt like the world just got like three times the size with this one, and showed me things that I didn't expect from a series like that. And it was one of those where I was like, okay, this is good because I feel like you're growing with the characters. They're now teenagers and they're going through the teen angst and stuff like that. And it doesn't really shy away from that stuff. It's still very much approachable for that age. But it was when I realized, okay, this is going to be something where if you are the same age as these characters, you're going to grow along with these characters, and the story is going to change along the way. And this was the first semblance of that because I did really feel like books one and two were kind of interchangeable. Enjoyed them, but this was the first one where it really got deep and you dealt with some really heavy themes, and it got some actually a little bit of frights and stuff in with the Dementors. But again, I feel like Harry Potter's a series that everyone that hasn't read it is like, oh, it's stupid, it's for kids. Everyone who has read it is either super nostalgic for it and they're like, I don't know how it's aged. I reread this to my kids a couple years ago. It's still great. It's still fabulous. And I think everyone should revisit it. And there's a reason why no matter what bookstore you go in, you will always find a Harry Potter end cap because I really feel like that is like this generation's Chronicles of Narnia kind of thing, where it just kind of gets passed down through everybody just kind of passes it down to their kids, which I've successfully done. And I think everybody will continue to do it. And I think right there is where the series got really, really special, was Prisoner of Azkaban.
Interesting. So I have not read Harry Potter, but I have watched the films, and your description of Prisoner of Azkaban kind of reminded me about how I felt about that film. As in, I really liked the first two. I thought they were fun. They
Yeah, but
did
it
feel
grew up a little
young.
bit with that one. Mhm.
And then Prisoner of Azkaban, it still kind of had a charm to it, but it had some things that were a little bit scary. The plot was a little bit more complex with the time travel things. It had the visual flair of Alfonso Cuarón. I thought Prisoner of Azkaban absolutely fantastic film.
My favorite book, favorite movie in that series. Yeah, it's
I
great
love
stuff.
it. And I was probably the perfect age to be reading them, but just didn't pick it up for whatever reason. And I knew Harry Potter was popular. The moment that I knew that it was massive was when kids came to school and said they read Goblet of Fire in a day. And I'm like, that book's
Wow,
massive.
that's a
That book is
beast. Yeah.
huge. And however old, 10, 11, 12, however old I was at the time, that just blew my little mind. I was like, these
Yeah,
kids are
that
going
age.
nuts.
Yeah, see, me, I was a little older, obviously, but it was like to me, it was just like I was seeing young people reading, and I was like, "That's just great, man! I can't believe it." And to think that a few years later, I'm standing in line at midnight at a Walmart to get the last book in the series because I don't want to be spoiled. And every age group that you can imagine is
Yeah,
all just talking like we've known each other our whole lives. And I did read that one in one day because I didn't want to be spoiled. But I was a little older. But yeah, I think about
yeah.
that 12-year-olds reading like 700-page books in a day. That's crazy. I don't think we'll ever see that again. I don't think we will ever see that again in our lifetimes. It's amazing. So it's a special series for that reason.
Interesting. Well, this next book I read in two sittings, and I was
All
quite
right.
impressed with myself as an adult. But I'm certainly no kid reading Harry Potter, I guess. For my next sci-fi recommendation, I'm going with Permutation City by Greg Egan. So this is another cyberpunk book, but this one focuses a little bit more on the cyber than the punk. It is a story about a man that is trying to create eternal life through a digital world. And Greg Egan goes to such lengths, he puts such a detailed amount of thought into creating this world that it's not just descriptions of a cyber existence. He actually creates new physics in order to do so. Like the building blocks of how the universe works in this cyber world is different from ours. So there were portions of the book where I'm trying to understand the biology, the physics, the computing. I didn't get it all. I would be lying if I said I understood everything in this book, but it was just story wise so interesting, like thematically so interesting that I would just kind of let it wash over me, let it sink in, and I would just go along for the ride. And this book aged really well. It was written in 94, and it feels like it was written in like 2024. Uh, Greg Egan, in terms of his understanding of like maths and computing, he really created something brilliant here. And I know when I pitch things as hard sci-fi, it's usually because the ideas are good, but you're sacrificing the characters, you're sacrificing a bit of story. Not the case with Permutation City. Almost the end of every chapter left my jaw on the floor. There were a couple of kind of crazy M. Night Shyamalan, I see dead people type twists, and I just had to keep reading and reading and reading. I'm only understanding half of it, but I'm reading and reading and reading, and I think it thoroughly paid off. So if you even just have a small tolerance for hard sci-fi, I would highly recommend giving Permutation City a try.
No, that sounds cool because usually my problem with these harder sci-fi authors is their characters are just whatever. They're just like blank avatars. That's why I bounced off Three Body Problem. Yeah, neat idea. I couldn't tell you one thing about any of these characters about 70% in the first book. And I was like, it's like I'm a character first. I got to have some characters. I don't care how great your world is or your prose is or how smart you are if you don't have characters that I relate to. Or that or you got to have one banging idea. Because I don't think that Michael Crichton necessarily was known for his character work, but his
Mm.
ideas were always just so fascinating to me. And that's why his book, and they were super easy to read, super quick. But no, you saying that, that's actually the ones you've listed. That's one I'm most interested in for sure.
Yeah, this one I would say if you're a character reader, I'm not going to compare it to like Stephen King or anything like
Sure,
that,
sure.
but I would say it's a little bit more. The characters are maybe a little bit more relatable, have a little bit more personality than the Three Body Problem, which is a series I still love. You can see it over here. But I read all three books, and I could probably only tell you like four character names.
I'm
That's
gonna watch
not
the
the
Netflix
purpose of the
series because
series.
because I said with that is I felt like the Netflix series could actually improve it because it would actually have to do some character work,
Hmm.
to keep the viewers interested. So I like the ideas. I needed some kind of character thing. So, did you watch the Netflix show?
I'm watching it at the moment. I'm up to episode 7, and
As someone who loves the books, are you happy?
I'm quite happy. They've made quite a lot of changes, and I think a lot of the changes I understand for reasons that you mentioned in
Yeah,
order to sort of condense the timeline a little bit. And they've created some characters, combined some characters, because I think for a modern TV audience, you couldn't really just create a TV show where the characters are almost pointless.
yeah.
Really, the only character with any personality is Benedict Wong's character, which I love that casting because while reading the book, I pictured Benedict Wong. Normally, I'm
Nice.
not someone that casts my books, but that actor just popped into my mind for that particular character, and he's actually in the show, which is great.
I love when that works out. Pretty cool.
There you go. Mike, what is your fourth fantasy book?
Well, you are technically reading this fantasy right now. So
Ooh,
1997 is the most fantasy-ish volume in this series. This is Wizard and Glass. I got a special edition cover on here,
ooh,
so you
very
won't
nice.
recognize it. But yeah, Wizard and Glass is book number 4 in the Dark Tower. And the reason I picked this one is because this one has the most fantasy elements in it, and it gives you the long, drawn out history of this character. So for 3 books, you've heard about all this stuff that our main character Roland went through, and a lot of people got upset because it does have like a 600-page flashback in the middle of the book. Me, I was like, I want these answers. I wanted to know this, so it was great for me. And the fact that the backstory was really, really good. It was everything I hoped it could be. But it's almost kind of like a Arthurian kind of legend, but they've got pistols instead of swords. And I always love that idea about it. So Dark Tower, obviously, it's very strange, and it won't be for everyone, but I will say is it has a little something for everyone. It is really a great mashup of many things, but I felt like Wizard and Glass was very much the most fantasy feeling of them all. But I think it's an amazing series, and I'll always consider it fantasy, even if you're just considering Portal fantasy. There's other world than these kind of thing because it is all parallel universes and stuff.
Yeah.
But I will say this about it, there is not another fantasy series like it. Like most fantasy series, all these I've named, whatever, you can look at it and be like, okay, I feel like this borrowed from this, or that harkens back to this. Makes me think of this series. Dark Tower, nothing. There's nothing out there that you'll say, oh yeah, it's like Dark Tower, unless it's just completely after the Dark Tower and they said, hey, I like the Dark Tower too. But I'm saying up to that point, nothing else feels like Dark Tower.
That's awesome because I am actually reading The Dark Tower. I am up to book 5, Wolves of the Kala, right now. And
Like,
it's funny, if you had pitched Wizard and Glass to me beforehand and said, Jonathan, this is by far the longest book in the series so far, and a massive chunk of it is a flashback, I
mhm.
would have said, this is going to be my least favorite. And I read it, and it was my favorite. It was by far my favorite of the
People
first
love it
4
or
books.
hate it, yes, but most fantasy fans tend to love it because we want that story, we wanna know all that stuff that happened before, because a lot of those series will talk about, "Oh, this happened back then," but then the author doesn't wanna actually write that, and Steven says, "Yeah, I'll write that, no big deal." I think a lot of people now that are binging the series, it's not such a big deal. Like people like me that were waiting for each one of these books got mad when they were like, okay, well,
Mm.
look, our characters have been on this overpass for like 12 years now. Can I find out what's happening next? So
Yeah.
yeah, I think that there was some little grievances with that. But new people coming to the series now and they can just run through it. They don't have as much of a problem with it doing the flashback.
That makes sense. Because I enjoyed the non-flashback scenes as well, but the flashback in particular just combines so many great elements in terms of the characters, the relationships, the ideas, kind of linking things to what we've already learned and what might be to come. I thought it was just absolutely masterful. And the series had always been a mashup of fantasy, sci-fi, western, horror, but this was the first one where I felt like it kind of put all of those together specifically in a way that was sort of like a love letter to literature itself. It,
Mm.
it reminded me a little bit of Dan Simmons in that way, kind of incorporating all these previous works and using them to elevate what was already just kind of a bonkers and very original tale that Stephen King was telling.
Yeah, I hope you like the ending. I'll be interested to see how you feel about the end.
Yes, I'll have to let you know my thoughts on the
Book
on the
6
last 3
made me
books.
flip tables, not gonna lie.
Uh-oh.
We'll see what you think. I can't wait to hear it.
They're down here. I might have to read 6 and 7 back to back. We'll we'll find out. All right, awesome. Okay, for my fifth and final sci-fi book, I've been a little bit sneaky here. I've kind of I've Mike might not love this one. I've gone with The Fall of Hyperion by Dan Simmons. I love The Fall of Hyperion, and I know that Mike's not the biggest fan. And if Mike comes back at me and says, Jonathan, the first book, Hyperion, was better. Well, that came out in 1989. I'm sorry.
Ah, yes.
Not
Well,
a,
no, Hyperion is one of the best sci-fi books I've ever read in my life, so it felt like it was just unreal expectations in hindsight, for sure. But go ahead, go ahead.
if only it was eligible for this video, Mike. No, I'm kidding. I love both of these books, but I am Team Fall. I am prepared to admit I'm somewhat lonely on Team Fall. There's room to join me. If it was a life raft, we're not throwing anyone overboard. There's plenty of room left on the raft. But I'll give you my case for the Fall of Hyperion. I loved Hyperion. I loved the journey of each of the different pilgrims traveling to Hyperion, the backstory, their reason for going, each of the different subgenres. As a sci-fi fan, I love that we got all of those different subgenres for all of those tales. But maybe it's just the way my mind works. I wanted a little bit more progression in the present timeline. I felt Hyperion ended, and some people think it's the perfect ending. I felt like the book was just getting started. So I was very eager to go into the Fall of Hyperion. And you know what? The first 100 pages, they're kind of slow. It introduces some new guy. I'm like, who the heck's this new guy? I just read a whole book to get to find out what happens, and we're still introducing new stuff. But once we get going, man, this is space opera at its finest. So many cool characters, so many big ideas, from the Ousters to the Templars to the Technocore. I'm going to have to ask Rockio about this because I feel like there are some elements of this that might have influenced some
Yeah.
portions
Yeah, I've talked to him about it. Yeah,
Sun Eater.
Hyperion's Dan Simmons overalls, just having the time tombs are a very big influence on him for sure.
Absolutely. And it really hit me. There was a few moments in here which had just an enormous emotional impact where I actually stopped and thought to myself, this is why I read. I really, really love The Fall of Hyperion, despite its quirks. There's a couple of things that go in odd directions. There's a couple of things that just kind of end. Not every narrative thread is perfect, but for me, the highs were so high, I don't care about any of its faults. It's still just one of the most enjoyable books I've ever read.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. To me, it was very much a sophomore slump. I think the way I compared it was, say if when George Lucas was pitching The Empire Strikes Back, he says, instead of going back with Han, Luke, and Leia in this one, how about I give it from the point of view of just the droids watching Senate meetings?
Yeah.
That's how I felt about it. It was like they took all these characters that I grew to love in that first book and kind of made them almost background characters. I'm still not sure exactly what happened with Shrike. Like I'm still like, maybe I just read it wrong. I don't know. I'm still not exactly sure what happened. But yeah, there are great, great moments in it. It's just again, I think the first one just set my expectations way so high that in hindsight, I feel like if I took more time and then waited and then read it instead of just reading it immediately after, might have enjoyed it a touch more. So definitely not the worst book I've ever read. It's just I just didn't like the shift in narrative. They didn't want them changing kind of like the point of view. I like the Canterbury Tales kind of style that he did with the first one. And like, maybe just nothing will ever beat the Priest's Tale or the Poet's Tale for me. Those are both just like permanently ingrained in my memory.
Yes. Yes, if the structure was the thing that drew you to Hyperion, it doesn't use the same structure, so that might be a disappointment. For me, that wasn't as big of an appeal. And I agree with you, those were some of my favorite stories as well. I feel like the way that the Scholar's Tale in particular concludes in the Fall of Hyperion is great. But yeah, some things are confusing. And if you read the second duology, Endymion and the Rise of Endymion, some things will become more clear, and some things will become even more confusing because Dan Simmons does a fair amount of retconning.
As
Uh,
you say, isn't the Shrike like old like Harry and the Hendersons now? He's like old buddy, old pal and stuff with him now. I mean, I see him on the raft with him on the cover, and I'm just like, so the Shrike's a nice guy now.
who
Okay.
knows the motivations of that mysterious strike? You'll have to read and find out.
Still one of the coolest covers of all time is
Oh, yes.
both Hyperion and Fall of Hyperion. Still two of the
Let's
coolest
go.
covers I've ever seen. Yeah.
I'm glad you
All right,
said
my
that
fifth and
because
final book.
I was just gonna
This is
say I
not.
love the Hyperion cover, and Whitney from the Secret Source of Storycraft came on and said that the Hyperion cover sucks and it looked like a cheesy romance novel, and I was like, no, I love that cover. So I'm glad
Wow, I
you're
got that
Team
printed up and
Hyperion cover.
above my bookshelf. I love that art so much. Honestly, that art is what made me want to read that book. I mean, I
Yes.
saw it in my brother's bedroom when I was a preteen. I was like, "What is? I don't even care what this is. I've got to read this. It looks amazing."
What's the deal with that pointy
20 years
guy?
later, I finally read it. But glad I did. I did.
I'm
Great
glad you
series. I
like
need to
it
read
too.
more Dan Simmons. I tried Summer of Night, just didn't click for me. But Christopher tells me that I'll love Ilium. He says that Ilium would be one that I just completely eat up. He said it's basically like Odysseus with lightsabers. I'm like, well, that's a hell of a sales pitch right there. You ever read that one?
I really let's see, Ilium and Olympus. I really like those two. I thought they had equally high points, but there was a little bit more misses for me in that series, but still awesome
So
moments.
should I do that or Endymion?
Well, my general
Or neither?
advice is if you liked Hyperion and didn't like the Fall, it's probably not worth continuing because it kind of gets
Wow.
further and further away from what Hyperion was.
Okay.
If you like the Fall, then keep going. So for you, I'd maybe recommend trying Ilium instead.
Okay. Well, to be kind of on the same page as you here, I'm going to cheat. because the series started in the 80s, but book number 3 came out in 1990. So I'm going to say The Halfling's Gem by R.A. Salvatore.
Nice.
Again, this is fantasy royalty here, guys. I know some people are just like, "Oh, Salvatore." I read that stuff when I was like in junior high. I didn't. I never read Drizzt until like 2 years ago, and I love it. I love Drizzt. I think it's just so much fun. They're short, pulpy reads. It's not a big deal. There's nothing really overbearing about them that you're not going to understand. That's okay. It's like that tells people sometimes with TV, not everything has to be an Emmy Award winner. Sometimes it's fun just to have some candy and some popcorn, right? That's how I feel about these. I think that it's got such a fun group. It's traditional fantasy at its finest. You're not going to see stuff that's going to be have to have trigger warnings. You're not going to have stuff that's going to have to be like explicit content. There's overbearing sex scenes and violence and stuff, but it has very serious moments, and bad things can't happen to these characters, and it deals with a lot of heavy themes, I think. But I
Mm,
feel like it's very underrated at this point, which sounds weird because there's like 40 something of these books. So it sounds weird to say they're underrated. I feel like the modern audience is really underrated and say, "Oh, well, that was just, that's just pulpy Dungeons and Dragons stuff. That's not that big a deal." I think they're awesome. And I've had just I mean, I've read 7 of them now, and I've loved every single one of them. And with this one, what I loved about actually the Halfling's Gym is because character that you think really can it change when a character that doesn't speak? I'm talking about Guinevere, his mystical panther, is a character you think, oh, that character doesn't talk or nothing. Like they can't cheat like Robin Hobb does, where she actually has her actual animal companion talk, and I feel like that cheats and makes you get more endeared to him. Actually finds a way to have really good character growth in this book because it has like this amazing moments. And I just thought that was
interesting.
such a neat idea. And I was like, I'm a full on, I want a panther now. I know it's not safe, but I want one now. But yeah, it's just a fun series. Again, you don't have to read Dungeons and Dragons to read The Legend of Drizzt. It's really great introduction fantasy or moderate fantasy where you really just don't have to really I don't want to say don't have to think. It's just you don't have to sit here and make like an Excel spreadsheet for all the character names and all the legends and the lore and stuff. You really can just jump right in. If you play Dungeons and Dragons, great, great. You'll know what some of these creatures are without him explaining them to you. But I think that he does give these characters enough growth to where you feel like you're powering up with them, and it's a fun way, not the kind of the cradle way, but kind of the fun way where you're watching these characters go through training and get better and overcome some really impossible odds. But again, it's just like the friendships in these books are just so enjoyable. And I'm rambling, but this is really fun.
I
I
like
think
that.
that you haven't read any fantasy at all. I think R.A. Salvatore, perfect introduction. Start with the Crystal Shard, which is book 1 of Icewind Dale. Really, really good.
I like that little drive by on Cradle.
I try not to. Cradle and Three Body always seem to be like my go-to because it's like 2 series that everybody swore I would love. And when I started reading, I'm like, why did you guys think I would like this? Especially Cradle, because I was like, dude, I love playing Final Fantasy too. I don't like to read about getting experience points. That's what I felt like all that series was. And everyone started telling me, "Oh yeah, well, it's not really a character book." Again, you could have the greatest idea, the greatest character, the greatest world, the greatest writing. I need something from your characters.
That's
I didn't get
funny.
it from that
I
one.
would, as a character reader, I would have been reluctant to tell you that you would love Three Body because it's probably the least character focused series that I have ever read. So I think that's a funny recommendation. Although you do like Arthur C. Clarke, and I feel like Cixin Liu is inspired by Arthur C. Clarke. So there's maybe some elements that I thought you might have liked, but I can
I've
totally
still
see why
only
it didn't
read
click.
Childhood's End, but Childhood's End was good enough to say, yeah, that's one of the best sci-fi authors ever. Because Childhood's End is amazing.
I have the folio edition. It's in my top 10 books of all time. I'm a big Childhood's
It's
End
it was
fan.
close. I did my top 10 books last year, and it was close, but it did make my I think my top 5 of my sci-fi books of all time, and that's I think I'm gonna do 2001 next, 'cause that's the one that I have. But did you read Rendezvous with Rama?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I wanna read that one because Denny V, who did the adaptation of Dune, wants to actually adapt that next, and I'm like, "Okay, well,
Yes.
I gotta read this then." So, which would you recommend, 2001 or Rendezvous with Rama?
Ooh, I liked both of them. I preferred 2001 slightly, but Rama's great too, and it's yeah, with the film coming out, I think it's a good idea to read it beforehand. I'm
So,
really excited to see what the visuals are going to look like.
does the book of 2001 actually like, the ending actually makes sense? Because the movie don't. I was like, "Did I not do enough drugs or something?" I feel like I'm watching a Pink Floyd light show right now.
A little bit. I think they work well in tandem. I wouldn't say it gives you all the answers, but I really like the ending for 2001 because I thought I started coming up with theories. I'm like, I think it meant this, but maybe it's this. I'm going to go Google. And it was one of those books that made me excited to talk about other readers with it, to see the different interpretations.
Dude, the baby. I'm also probably
Star
the only one
Child.
through like 2010 though, so who knows?
Oh, interesting. I
The
haven't
film.
gone
Obviously, I
past.
haven't read it. Honestly.
I haven't watched or read it. I stopped at 2001, so maybe one day I'll pick it up because I am a big Clark fan.
So you didn't say Dune, so I'm just. I mean, I guess it's not 80s, it's not 90s. Never mind. I'm stupid. I just try to find any reason I can to get people to talk about Dune.
When did
So
the
you mean
last
like
one come out? In the one last one that
gosh,
Herbert that Frank wrote,
yeah, I think the 80s.
maybe
Like no,
80s.
because I think God Emperor came out in like 82 because George Lucas immediately stole a bunch of ideas
Yeah.
for Return of the Jedi. Um, Gosh, that's a great question. I should know this. See, the thing is, like I always tell people to stop after God Emperor, so maybe I don't know. I don't
Interesting.
know.
Well, I have read Dune, but I haven't read the whole series. But Dune Messiah will actually be the next book I pick up after Walls of the Kala. So I'll let you know how I go with the rest of my Dune journey.
Be interested in how you feel about that because man, though you want to talk about some sequels that get some slander. So I made that video about like, no, not all the Dune sequels suck. Because I hear people say that all the time. Like, no, they don't. They're just not like book one. They're very different, but they don't all suck. I hate that. I was a big Star Wars fan reading the EU books, and everyone's like, "Oh, who cares if they decanonize it? They all suck." And I'm like, "You suck." I was like, I poured so many years of my life into that canon. Damn it.
The interesting thing about the Dune series to me is that while the first book is clearly the most well beloved overall, all of the other books have their detractors, but also people that love them. I feel like
Yeah,
I've heard someone tell me that every single book is their favorite. Like someone's like, book two's the best. No, book four's the best. Well, book three was my favorite. Like it strikes different chords with different people. So we'll see which
man. Look,
one
I like God Emperor,
resonates.
but man, if you're saying God Emperor is your favorite Dune book, you must be on a higher plane of existence than me because holy. I'll leave it at that.
All right, I'm excited. Well, there you go. Those were 10 sci fi and fantasy recommendations from the 90s. Hopefully, it inspired you to pick something up. Mike, this was fun. Thank you for joining me.
Hey man, I thanks so much for having me. I'd love to talk about the 90s. The 90s look like I'm an 80s kid. I grew
Yeah,
up in the but you know what? My coming of age was in the 90s, so I have so much nostalgia for the 90s. And I feel like these things go in 30-year cycles. Like, last decade everything was about the 80s. Now it seems like this decade everything's starting to be about the 90s. I'm going to feel really
yeah,
old next year when we're talking about the 2000s. It's going to be really really weird.
yes, me too. We'll we'll try to stave that off as long as possible.
Right. Hey,
Maybe
thanks a ton for inviting me. I appreciate it.
yeah, maybe in 10 years we'll do our 2000s list.
Oh yeah, I can't wait to talk about pop-up video. It'll be fun. It'll be fun.
Well, thanks for watching, guys. You know what to do. Click all the buttons and stuff. Go subscribe to Mike, and yeah, we'll see you on the next one.